Welcome to the South African Chamber of Commerce and one of our ongoing series of webinars to provide value to our members. We have members and we have non-members present from more than one continent, which is very welcome to see. I think we're probably on at least 4 continents from what I can see so far. I'm Sharon Constanson. I'm Chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce here in the UK, and welcome our guest and our host for tonight. Our host is actually sitting in Spain at the moment, and this is the value of being able to run webinars, be able to work from home, work from holiday, work from whatever environment we can be in. So we welcome our guest today. We have just on an hour's time together, where we're going to learn some really fascinating insights from Liz and John, who is a founding member of the South African Chamber in the UK, was a director of the Chamber, now on our advisory board, and a very well-known journalist, and has some very keen skills in getting information covered and discussed in his conversations. So without further ado, I will see you when it comes to question time a little bit later. John Battersby, I'd like to please hand over to you.
So thanks very much again, Sharon, for the introduction. And Liz, are you with us? Okay, well, it's fantastic to have you here, live, albeit on Zoom, to talk about this extraordinary book. For those of you who don't know Liz, but I'm sure you've all read the background on the invitation, Liz McGregor has written and edited several books, including subjects as diverse as load shedding and rugby. The Springbok Factory as one of the books that she produced. And she's worked as a journalist in Cape Town, in Johannesburg, Seoul in Korea, and in London for the better part of a decade, where she was the deputy editor of the opinion section of The Guardian. So welcome, Liz, and we can see behind you this extraordinary book that you have written, Unforgiven, Face to Face with My Father's Killer. A very dramatic title indeed, and I have to say that it is a brilliantly written book, and visceral is the word that keeps coming back to me. You take one immediately into your world, and it's very, very compelling to read. And although it is indeed a book which you will tell us about in a moment, which was sparked by your father's tragic and untimely death, it has given you a vehicle for actually exploring contemporary South Africa and the forces that led to where South Africa is today. I must just say that some of the cameos that you paint there, for instance, you're growing up in the sugarcane fields, Glendale in KwaZulu-Natal, are absolutely magnificent to read. Descriptive powers are wonderful. So if we can start off with the obvious question, because that always seems to be the place to start. If you could just take us a little bit into how you came to write the book, because I do believe that it was a kind of a staged process and it wasn't sort of one Damascene moment. So how did you come to write the book?
Thank you, John. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Sharon and the South African Chamber of Commerce in the UK for hosting this. Well, my father was murdered in 2008. One person was arrested because he was found with my father's car. And he was then kept in custody for 2 years while they built a case against him. And there was a trial in 2010. But the trial itself was, because he pleaded not guilty, they had to assemble all the evidence against him. And he just kept telling lies. He just kept telling different stories. Excuse me. None of which really made any sense. So it was a very traumatic thing. We were lucky we had a trial. And only sort of 10% or 11% of murder cases end up in a trial. But it was very confusing. A gang connection came up for the first time we didn't know about. So at the end of it, I thought, so he was sent down for 30 years, which was wonderful. But I still felt I didn't really understand what had happened. And the whole thing was just so traumatic, I didn't really want to absorb it at that point. And then 2017, I was knocked down by a car and quite badly injured. And I think the shock of that took me back into the shock of what happened during the murder. And sort of the adrenaline was pumping again. And it sort of gave me the impetus to sort of, I thought I had to get to the, find out exactly what had happened. I now had the impetus to do it. I had all this adrenaline raging, all the sort of post-traumatic stress syndrome symptoms from the trial were kind of raging back. So I was a kind of a woman possessed. I knew I just had to do it. And the obstacles were not minimal.
Okay, we'll talk about the obstacles later, Liz. But thank you very much for that. And it's really interesting to me that although your father's death was 14 years ago, it was actually a second tragedy, your car accident, which led you to actually start writing the book 5 years ago. And that is very interesting that this book, which is a remarkable book, has come from two tragic events, actually, which has given you that focus. And the way that you pursue the story, because at the end of the day, it is a story. It's a story about your father's death, is exceptional, because you approach it on the one hand like an investigative journalist, where actually nothing else matters. That is what is driving you for that time, and at the same time, you are writing about somebody very close to you, namely your father, your loved ones. So it would be interesting to hear a little bit about how you manage that conflict, but perhaps first to tell us about your father, and why was he as important as he was as your father. He was also important to the broader society in the work that he'd done with the competitions and the concentration of ownership in the corporate sector, and his founding of the Who's Whom directory. Tell us a bit about your father, and then how you managed that conflict between being an investigative journalist and a loving daughter.
Sure. Well, my father was quite a restless man. So he worked in several different industries. He didn't really take authority lightly. So I think he'd get into a job and then sort of, think he could do it better than the boss, and then it would be a clash and he'd move on. So he worked in many different industries. He worked in the beer industry, in the chicken industry, in the animal feed industry, cartons, apples. So by the time he was 50 odd, he had quite a lot of experience, and of course the sugar industry for a long time. And then he realized that every time he left a company, there was some big monster behind gobbling up that company and getting bigger and bigger. So at the age of, I think he was around 50, it was the early 80s. He went part-time on his job, and he went to every single share register in the country. Remember, at this point it was all paper. Nothing was online. So he had to go sit patiently in share registry offices and wait for the secretary to deign to see him. So obviously they weren't very keen. And he also, he bought one share in each company, so he got the share registers. And then he spread all this out on our very large dining room table, because we have 5 children, we're a large family. And he just added them all up. And he came to this very, very startling revelation, which was new at the time, was that the entire JSE was owned by 5 companies, or 80% of it was owned by 5 companies, 5 vast conglomerates. And this was as a result of sanctions. So as British and American and other multinationals left the country, the smaller companies were all bought up by these 5 conglomerates. Now, what he recognized was, how powerful it made them, because they could set prices, and a lot of them were working in connivance with the apartheid government, so the labor laws and control of unions, all this was affected by the fact that we had this incredible concentration of wealth and economic power in a very, very limited number of hands. And of course, he got a lot of kickback, especially from Anglo-American. And, but, his facts were there. They were all correct. So he, being the entrepreneur, he then went to a publisher who said they would give him 10% of the profits. As we all know as writers, that's how it happens. And he just said, no, that's not good enough. So he formed his own publishing company called Purdy, because he loved rifles and shotguns. That was one of his hobbies. And of course, the Purdy is the prince of, or the princess of rifles. Anyway, and then he published it himself. He found a publisher. He lugged the books personally to bookshops. And the advertising was easy because it was such a big revelation. It was seized upon by the country's media with great enthusiasm. And in a very, very short period of time, it became a bestseller. And, he became extremely well known. So I think, what he proved was basically that. So he became very, very well known, and he was either derided or regarded as an absolute hero. Mostly the left, but you can imagine how that sort of reaction divided between those affected, to what extent people were affected by it. But certainly he saw it as a pro-poor thing. He was outraged by, in this country where so many people were already, incredibly hard time. Things were made that much more difficult by the capitalist class who came to be completely, neutral. They weren't part of apartheid, but in fact they were very much involved because of the setting of prices, in making things tougher for people who things were really extremely tough. To get back to, so he was a very driven man, very sort of A-type personality, restless, but very, very, very clever. And then to get back to how I combined being a daughter with the investigative journalism. Well, journalism I've done, like my entire life. So it is it's my way of approaching the world, to find things out, to expose the truth. I mean, that's very much kind of the core of who I am. So that kind of takes over in a way, and this sort of doggedness and determination, and I suppose confidence in a way. And then as a daughter, I just felt I owed it to him to find out what had happened to him. He was a man who always wanted the truth. He always wanted to know what was going on. So I felt I owed it to him to find out exactly what had happened to him and why, because the whole thing was a bit of a mystery. It came out of the blue. He was just murdered by what appeared to be a gang in a small little town of Tulbagh, which had not seen much violent crime. Pretty little winelands town. And, it was a very, very savage murder. I don't want to go into the details because it's quite upsetting, but you can read all about it in the book, Unforgiven, available largely on Amazon, but also in bookshops in the UK and South Africa. Sorry for that little editorial there. And because I had that adrenaline, I was able to fight my way through it, which was a bit terrifying because I then got involved in, obviously, in a very murky underworld of gangsters and like the very, very dark side of the Western Cape, South Africa, and the Western Cape in particular.
Very interesting, Liz. Thank you. And to go back to your father's role, Robin McGregor, as a social activist and a change agent. In the interview that you did with the former finance minister, Trevor Manuel, he described your father as an incredibly important figure who, in fact, had, through his exposure of the concentration of wealth in those five companies, had in fact been largely instrumental, or certainly partly instrumental, in changing the economic structure at that time of corporate life. So that is a really interesting fact. To get back to the other contradiction that struck me in the book, because your father, if I remember correctly, is third generation Scottish, right? And
well, in fact, his father came from my father's father came from Scotland. But
okay.
he Alexander, But he moved on to London to sail South Africa and got his landlady's daughter pregnant. So my grandfather was brought up here and came to South Africa in about 1920. So first generation in a way.
First generation, yeah. Okay. And then it comes through in the book on several occasions that while your father was pro-poor and liberal by disposition, there was lurking beneath a kind of fear of what might happen in South Africa in the future. And on several occasions, he talks about this fear of, the period in which I think he says it might happen. It was always within 5 years, although there's a moving circus, that the blacks might rise up, black South Africans might rise up and drive the whites into the sea. So is that something that impacted on you and influenced you in any way? And what impact did that have on you?
Well, I mean, yeah, as I say, I remember from dinner parties as a young child, my father always saying, 5 years' time, black people will rise up and drive us into the sea. It was always that sense of precariousness, I think, of sort of looming retribution. And because he was of liberal disposition, he believed that he understood our history, and he believed it was to some extent justified. So, excuse me. And then, of course, I then went, very much of that book was trying to understand our history, because what I couldn't understand, what I found difficult to come to terms with, was how violent his death was, how brutal it was, and why they had to kill him, why they couldn't just take the stuff. But also how violent our country is at the best of times. In the first 3 months of this year, there were 6,000 murders and over 10,000 reported rapes. And there's something like 17,000 murders every year. So why, and what that took me back to, actually, was the fact that our country is so founded in violence. So you have the British colonial wars, where they wiped out, Xhosa and Zulu, those wars that went on for like decades and decades until people were like destroyed, and cultures were destroyed, and people's sense of being, and it was profound, as a profoundly violent setting for where we white people came in. And then there were the mines, where my great-grandfather Alexander actually worked on the same mine, East Rand Proprietary Mines, as Nongoloza. He was the founder of the number gangs who were involved in my father's murder. And Nongoloza, he set up this band of warriors who rejected work in the mines because they could see that that people died at a very young age after going underground, as did my great-grandfather. They were paid very little, particularly unskilled, and black work was only allowed to be unskilled even during the British era. That's where it started. They earned very little. They died young. It was not worth it. So people going to the mines, he would recruit into his gang, which became a sort of anti-colonial force, because they adopted uniforms and the insignia and the ranks of the Boer armies and the British armies. This is very shortly after the Anglo-Boer War. And it is such a profound ideology and hold that's persisted to this day. The number gangs still dominate the prisons, and they are very, very active in all the gang activity, which is growing in the Western Cape in particular. So there was that also very, very violent period where black people were turned into criminals in order to get cheap labor for the mines. And then, of course, apartheid, which was just a series of dehumanization, both black people and white people. So we just had this incredibly horrendous history, which has made us who we are, and it's tragic. And I think that's that to me is the most coherent way to understand why we are so violent.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that, and we'll probably come back to what one can do about it later. But just the other thing that really struck me is that there was a very coherent process and plan to deal with that violent past. with the negotiated settlement, if one can call it that, in 1994, which was very much based on the principles of reconciliation and restorative justice and righting the wrongs of the past so that one could sort of start anew on the basis of racial equality. Now, your experience in trying to get to the bottom of the why in your book seems to have led to considerable disillusionment with that whole negotiated settlement, and particularly the principle of restorative justice, which I think you describe as being really kind of just words and idea rather than reality. Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Yes. Yeah, thank you, John. I think that was a very interesting aspect of it, but also disappointing. That when I first started on this journey, I went to the prison where he was held, and they said to me, "You have to. The only way you can see him," is I said I wanted to see him. I wanted to find the facts, thinking it would be simple, naively. And they said the only way you can do this is by entering something called a victim-offender dialogue. So I said, fine. And then they said, "Oh, we are so happy to see you. We're always trying to get the victims to come and talk, and we've always got to chase them. How you just turn up? This is so wonderful." And then I never heard from them again. They just effectively kind of ghosted me. So I did meet, not coincidentally, but through my own sort of tracking her down, was one of his relatives, the relatives of Cecil Thomas, the man who was convicted of my father's murder. And the first thing she said to me was, "How is your family doing?" And this ended up being the most healing moment, because I think it's an acknowledgement of your pain. It's an acknowledgement of the victim. So whereas a court case is very much, the professionals take over. It's between the accused and the state. And the family is just, completely incidental, and so is the victim. With restorative justice is much more, the family and the victims are much more powerful. And so it becomes a sort of empathetic thing of recognizing, making the perpetrator acknowledge and recognize what he or she has done. So you're creating empathy. It's a very powerful way towards sort of rehabilitation of some kind. And this, as you say, is what our country was founded upon. It was the democratic order. It was Nelson Mandela who did this magnificent act of, forgiveness. And then the TRC, which was all about excavating, past damages and coming to terms with them. And then, even our prison laws, they sort of very grandly say, we are work towards restorative justice because, apart from anything else, it's the most effective way of rehabilitating prisoners. It helps to, once they acknowledge what pain they've caused towards their victims, it's a much more effective way of reincorporating them. But my experience was none of this happened. None of this happened at all. In fact, it was very, very difficult to actually get to see them at all. And this to me is tragic because, our prisons are full to bursting. People there get deeply involved in the gangs. And then they come out sort of really kind of hardened criminals, and there's no ways that they're going to be accepted back into society, so it just makes things worse. So that was very disappointing.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Interesting, and a somewhat depressing reality, but something that you had to face in writing the book. But although you were disillusioned by, let's say, faith in the negotiated settlement and the founding principles of the democratic post-apartheid order, you nevertheless clearly reached some kind of closure for yourself in having pursued this whole story with such incredible dedication and vigor. And I think readers would be particularly interested to hear about what closure meant for you and how has it changed your life.
Look, if you read the book, you'll see that I didn't get what I hoped for. I saw him, but it wasn't entirely conclusive. But it certainly was cathartic for me. Just because when something, and a lot of South Africans will have had this experience, when something so devastating happens to you, like a murder of someone close to you, first of all, I think you lose all your own sense of safety. And then the world suddenly seems an incredibly dangerous place, apart from the trauma and the grief. So there was always this kind of, this feels like this sort of monster lurking in the background, and which was so incomprehensible to me, so outside of my own experience, that it was just sort of, just sat like a dark cloud above me. So just finding out everything I possibly could about this man and why he got to the point where he did what he did. Just sort of putting him in context, in some ways that humanizing him rather than becoming a sort of nameless, sort of formless monster, just helped me. It made it manageable. And also, I mean, as you will see if you read the book, I explored my own, how I'd got to where I was and how I sort of felt about my country. And it was kind of excavation of myself as well. I mean, and that is partly because as a writer, I've written several nonfiction books. And, my first book was about Kabzela, who was a dear teacher who died of AIDS, in which I wrote about the life of a black man. And it's quite contentious because a white person writing about a black person, it's difficult. So I thought the only fair thing to do really was to write about myself as well. I mean, that, obviously was my own sort of story to tell. And I felt it was, that was the right thing to do. This is who I am. This is the position I'm coming from. And this would give you the background to why I'm telling the story the way it is.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And as you say, as readers read the book, some of those questions will be answered. But the way you deal with it in the book is very interesting and very engaging. That sort of brings us towards the issue of what happens now. You've moved forward as a person, and although it might not be closure in the kind of textbook sense of perpetrator meets victim and they reconcile. It certainly wasn't that, because for whatever reason, this Cecil Thomas had become so dehumanized, one can say, in his membership of gang and so on and so forth. Although one has to say, given his background, he was actually quite an unlikely person to have gone that route. But what about what happens next? And it's not that long before he's going to come up for parole, which means that he would then take his place in society again. One has no idea what kind of rehabilitation would have taken place, but one doesn't have a great deal of confidence from the story that you've told that he's going to be a basically different person. And as we know, these prison gangs, whether it's the 28 gang or whatever, are as powerful outside of the prisons as they are inside the prisons. So one wonders, or one can't help thinking that the possibilities for rehabilitation and therefore successful parole are very slim. What is your view on that?
Well, look, it's a difficult one. Obviously, I mean, my inclination and my kind of longing would, say, please, forgive this guy. He's serving once he's served his time, let him go. let him go back to his family and live his life. But given that there's been no rehabilitation process, he still hasn't acknowledged what he's done. And it seemed to me that it was impossible for him to do that within the context of which he's living. I mean, I could be wrong about this, but what I understood from his circumstances was he was so deeply embedded in the gangs that it's like joining a very, very dark cult. And once you're in, it's blood in, blood out. You try and leave, you die. Once that is who, they are the people to whom he is answerable, it seems. So even if he did come out, he would come out as a soldier of the 28 gang. And a brutalized man, with no hope, I would have thought, actually, of redemption. So apart from the sort of external factors of his own traumatized family, to what extent would they re-accept him? And then secondly, South Africa's horrendous unemployment rate. Who is going to give a job, even a skilled man like him, to a convicted murderer? So he'd end up selling drugs on behalf of the gang, is what I would imagine. So you're putting back into society a man who's even more dangerous than he was when he went in. So this is, to me, it's a huge failure of the system, and it makes me sad. But I can't see how, anyway, as to say, I've said, I'm going to leave this to my family, but very large family, and they will decide. But I think it's difficult.
And it also makes one think about his family, because they used to pitch up in quite large numbers at the court every day, and they seemed like decent people. Is he completely lost to his family? Is he completely alienated from his family? Or is there still some hope there?
Well, that's a very good question, because that was a very puzzling part of it all. Most murderers have this sort of very, very, not most, but have very, very damaged backgrounds. They come from huge abuse themselves. But he came from a large and loving family. His father was erratic and could be quite abusive, I think, just in terms of, beatings and things. So that could explain it partly. But in court, there was this huge family of mostly women who came there most days supporting him. He came from love. He was surrounded with a lot of love and support. And a large, I think it's quite a lot of his family is still with him. This relative that I spoke to, she still close contact with him and supports him. Because they love the person, not the deed, which, I can understand. And the other thing about him, which made him quite perplexing, was that he had no previous criminal conviction, and he had a trade. He was the first person in his family to get tertiary education. He had a very tradable skill, which was as a welder and a boilermaker. He had children. So the whole thing, it's still a bit of a mystery to me. There's something I needed to understand. And I think the answer is he got involved in drugs. He became a tip addict. And that was how he was sort of sucked into a deeper gang culture.
From which one can be rehabilitated if the system works. But if the system is broken, it makes it very, very difficult to do that kind of deep rehabilitation.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So to get back to the why, which you dealt with earlier, I think a lot of South Africans abroad, and probably quite a lot of people on this call, as you yourself say in the book, you are still, although you have been in both hemispheres, as I have been, as Sharon has been, we've operated in the UK and in South Africa quite extensively. One is still bound up with one's beginnings, with one's country, with one's associations and one's energy and identity. Identity doesn't change. It can adjust, but it doesn't change. So you feel bound up with South Africa in a positive sense, but also with its problems, which are quite severe at the moment, and don't seem to be heading in a particularly positive direction at the moment. What can South Africans do abroad to try and assist the country through this very difficult period, both in an economic sense, but also in in the broader sense, in terms of morale and in terms of business, which is an important part of trying to restore the economic order. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think what an awful lot of people I know grapple with. And obviously, I lived here for 13 years. I had a wonderful job at the Guardian. I was, I loved this life, and I still think it's a lovely life. Because now we're spending, just from the last year, we're spending more time in between. Look, I think partly, if you grow up in a country, it becomes so kind of seared into your. I've got lots of very, very lovely letters from South Africans after reading this book, and one of them talked about experiences that got seared into your core. And that was a lovely phrase, because basically that's what it is. You can't eradicate it. It's a very, very powerful sense of who you are. And I think particularly as white South Africans, we have a lot to be grateful for how we grew up, because we were, whether we liked it or not, we were privileged. It's like growing up as an upper class Brit. You have this sort of sense of confidence that takes you with you for the rest of your life. So I think we have to acknowledge that South Africa gave us a hell of a lot. So for me, that combination of that very kind of powerful, I go back home and it's just a sense of deep familiarity, which is just so relaxing, basically. And then also the sense of, I owe the country. I mean, we are part of the problem. Well, not me, us individually, but, us as white South Africans sort of owe the country in a way. So, I mean, my feeling would be, just try and do what you can, stay engaged. I think just one other thing was that, like last year during the pandemic, we were there for the first year. And when it first hit, I mean, there was a sense of like a possible apocalypse, because we lived in Sea Point and everything shut down and all these homeless people flooded in. And there was this absolute desperation on every street corner, because all the restaurants closed down and normally they eat from the bins and get money from tourists. And literally there was sort of little sort of starving bundles of rags and bones, and it was really, really heartbreaking. So a lot of women, largely in the area in Sea Point, got together and created this organization which fed them. So we made hundreds and hundreds of sandwiches of peanut butter and jam and soup, and fed these people every day, to the extent that we could, just try to alleviate the suffering. But always this anxiety that would bankrupt the country, that the country itself was it was slightly precarious, so there was huge anxiety around it. And then we came here in November to the UK, and it was just so different. Firstly, there was always a sense of the country obviously was under huge stress, but there was no danger of it going under. People would not starve. I think we were staying in Islington at the time and we saw about 3 beggars. So I think it's an awful lot easier to live here. I mean, even now, we're here for a few months, and it feels so easy to live here compared to South Africa. Whereas if you're middle class in South Africa, things are so, so much more difficult. And that particularly applies to black middle class, because they, often the families have not been able to accumulate wealth, and therefore, they are relied on to give other members of the family a leg up. So, but even white people, you know, they're constant demands, you know, as with these, you know, this people in Sea Point who fed the homeless people, like everybody. So, yeah. So I just think do whatever you can to help. If you find an organization that's working well in South Africa, fund it. Just be a positive force, not a negative one, or slagging off the country, you know. Do what you can to help, acknowledge your debt, acknowledge your own sort of humanity and being, you know, part of something.
Thanks, Liz. That's been really interesting, hearing your answers. I think Sharon is going to give us a few questions that have been going on to the Q&A now. Are you there, Sharon?
Yep. Hi. Afternoon, everybody. Or still morning. Morning. Depends on which country you're in and you're listening to me from. Liz, I found this, it's actually some of the occasions, I don't know if you would see it, but I've got frillens, as they say in Afrikaans. You're giving me goosebumps on some of the things that you've talked about and some of the trauma that you have been through. One of the things I wanted to ask from my perspective, you talked about you felt you owed to talk about yourself as well as talking about somebody else. How did that realization come about in your own mind? And was that also partly a cathartic process? And what did you learn about yourself that you would say you didn't know before you started that process? You frozen eyes, Liz? John, maybe I can ask you a question in the meantime. What did you find the most shocking when you read the book?
What did I find the most shocking? Well, the most shocking, without any question, is the actual murder itself. And we didn't want to put Liz through all that again.
No, you can feel the emotion. Mm-hmm.
The sheer brutality of the murder from somebody who was once a normal human being in the sense of you and I. And obviously something happened in his life which completely changed his life, and he became a captive of this gang. Because I always remember something Mandela said in one of the interviews I did with him. He said, you know, however ordinary somebody seems, however readily you dismiss somebody because you don't think they are of great consequence, there's a human being in every single person. And it's there to be discovered. Well, it's a real challenge to try and discover that human being. So that it was actual murder that shocked me the most. But what kind of affected me the most about the book was Liz's disillusionment with the restorative justice process and the principles on which our new constitution are founded, namely reconciliation, reparation, the restoration of justice. That I find deeply depressing, because although South Africa is going through a very difficult period at the moment in relation to many things, political, economy, services, if the travel is in the right direction, there's hope, and with hope, you can always build. When people feel there is no hope, that's when things get really serious. So that's why I found that a really upsetting part. I can fully understand how Liz came around to that. But the question to myself is, I can't accept that is a given, and that we have the wrong system in South Africa and it's never going to work. So one has to look for human interventions, and of course, which are going on all the time in South Africa, and creativity and innovation and so forth, to try and find a system which works, because it's quite clear that the current system doesn't work because the government of the day is out of touch with the people of the day.
And this is just one of many stories, but it's interesting. It's one that has covered the apartheid era, and we're seeing it in a post-apartheid era pair of eyes, which is actually that's the sort of the poles apart part of it that I found quite interesting. Is we are coming with a different lens, but it's about something that happened quite a good while ago.
Indeed so, and I think that's the real value, actually, of Liz's book, is that although she's writing something deeply disturbing, which many people would have left the country, would blame everything on the government of the day, she maintains a really mature balance on that, which is not easy. And I think that's of great value and a great example to people. The South Africans tend to be very knee-jerk in always looking for somebody to blame, rather than actually understanding the history and the dynamics that have led to where we are.
Where do you feel the family might be today? It's a large family, there are many of them, and a parole day may come one day. Where do you think their fear antennae might be sitting as a family?
The family of the perpetrator?
No, of Liz's family.
Of Liz's family. Sorry, just phrase the question again.
How might they be feeling that this man might come back into the real world, into the free world again?
I don't know. I haven't asked Liz that question, but I do know from.
Looks like Liz is joining us again.
I do know from some of the interviews Liz has done, and she can now deal with this if she's back with us, is that I believe that two of her siblings, she has 5 siblings, have not read the book. It's not an easy book to read, even if you are emotionally. It's an easy book to read because of the way it's been written, and that's brilliant. But it's not an easy book to read emotionally, because you've got to go into a very painful space. You've got to go into an incredible ordeal that Liz went through in dealing with her father's death and in writing this book. So, I don't know. But Liz, can you answer Sharon's question about whether members of your family would be fearful that there could be repercussions as a result of the book from the perpetrator or his family?
Liz, are you with us? You are off mute, but not on camera. I'm not quite sure if you can make it. If not, I will continue just to chat to John if we're not getting any success there. John, just a question from the floor. Do you think that in order to be successful, restorative justice needs to offer the culprit the possibility of some kind of reduction of sentence?
I think the reduction of sentence is less important than the strength of the system that provides the possibility of rehabilitation and parole. There's no use in releasing unrehabilitated murderers who are subject to the authority of a criminal gang, unfortunately.
It's that gang that is really the part that really disturbs me, is that degree, and it's not only this individual, how many of those gangs have impacted so many individuals who are going to potentially could come out worse than when they went in, which was using Liz's words.
Absolutely. I was a reporter in the Supreme Court in Cape Town 50 years ago, believe it or not. And one of the things that affected me most was these trials where there'd be 18 members of the 28 gang in the box for having committed a murder inside the prison. And I just remember feeling, this is just, where do you go with this? It's just a no hope. It's the end of the road, And it was very difficult to find the humanity in these prison gangs because they populate a different world. They've created a different world to be able to maintain their sanity.
Yeah, and it's a microcosm. Liz, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again.
Sorry.
No, these things happen. Just a question I'd like to ask you. It's coming from the floor. Is there a symbiotic or reciprocal relationship between the major gangs, the ones that you talked about in the Cape specifically, the politicians and the police within the South African environment?
It's hard. I think there's absolutely no doubt that there is, certainly within the police, and possibly within politicians as well. I mean, that I think is the most worrying thing, and dangerous thing. But to separate the two is now actually a bit terrifying. And there's a sort of underworld, especially in Cape Town, which is a dark underworld, which brings in all kinds of figures and, incorporates the sort of the above ground world in ways that are extremely alarming.
In your research, sorry, John, do you want to go ahead?
No, I was just going to say, Sharon, you had also asked, and it'd be interesting to get Liz's response to it, whether any members of your family fear any kind of retribution as a result of the trial, the sentence, the book.
I don't think so. Certainly not my family. I mean, I was worried about it for a bit, but I think that I don't want to reopen the case. For me, that's the end of it. So I think if I now wanted to sort of dig it all up again and implicate other people, then I might be at risk. But I've absolutely no desire or intention of doing that. For me, it's over now.
And one of the things I was asking earlier of John when you were unable to be with us is some of the things that shocked and impacted him on reading the book. And the question, and I think I asked you as you disappeared.
Sorry.
Not your fault at all. But maybe one of the last questions we can go through quickly is, in writing about yourself, at the time you were writing about the murderer, what was the key learning that you gained about yourself that is something you've got now as an asset that you might not have had before you started this exercise?
That's quite a profound question, and I'm still thinking about that. Look, I think it's partly that I've always lived with a lot of guilt about being a white South African. And that's this kind of source of a lot of anxiety, and I'm trying to put all that to rest now. I'm trying to think, okay, I can get on with my life. So I feel a bit more relaxed about being able to acknowledge the European side of myself, partly because I've been exploring my grandfather and great-grandfather from Scotland. So all my life I was South African. I didn't want anything to do. I've always been an ANC supporter. I mean, not now. I would not vote for them now. But always deeply, deeply South African, very part of those roots. I didn't want to be European. Now I think, actually, part of me is. I have to acknowledge that. And in a way, it's something of a relief. I can come here and I can enjoy London and not feel guilty about it. But on the other hand, I still, as I say, I was saying earlier, I feel deeply emotionally embedded in South Africa. And, my family's there, and I've got two brothers doing amazing things. In fact, three brothers. And, my brother Andrew has taken over Who Owns Whom, and he, from my father. So from this sort of stratospheric, bright sort of star that sort of appeared on the horizon from my father's research, he has now turned into a very steady, sustainable business which provides, incredibly useful information about Africa, about the economy all over Africa, the African economy. And then my other brother runs this preschool in the middle of an informal settlement in Tulbagh. And I cannot tell you how hard it is to do that unless you're here. I mean, it's almost impossible to comprehend. So I'm a trustee, so I understand what goes on. So initially it was just a little house and they had about 30 kids. And then people started moving in from the Eastern Cape. So all those hillsides are covered now in shacks. And anytime they try and build anything, they've got to have a security company there because obviously building materials are in great demand. There's an evangelical church nearby, which just makes these sort of terrible threats against the headmistress. But they provide 150 kids with a first-class, first-world, early childhood education.
Year after year. It's amazing what so many people have done and still do for South Africa. And it's the one thing that we definitely have as a thread through our membership of the South African Chamber here in the UK is I don't know how to do something I really want to do, which is something for South Africa. To be there as an individual, I might not be able to, but as a collective we can. And I think that's an important message that we bring as the Chamber is whatever we focus on, it must uplift the lives of the South African as an outcome somewhere in the process of what we're doing. So today has been another example of where you've told us how we are by telling your brother's stories, for example, telling your story, how the lives of South Africans can be better for that knowledge by all the numbers that are attending this webinar. We have been through a fascinating hour. I can't believe an hour is up. I really can't. Liz, thank you so much for your time. I don't know if there's one last statement you'd like to make, or whether, John, there's a last statement you'd like to make. We've got half a minute left.
I'd like to ask one last question, and it's a very personal question. And that is whether, as a result of the catharsis that you've been through, and it is an extraordinary one, and I think you've probably answered it already, do you like yourself more than you did before?
That's a very interesting question. God, I don't know, John. I mean, I think I have to go 5 more years of psychoanalysis to work that one out.
Okay, we'll let you off that one then.
All right, thank you. But thanks so much for a wonderful conversation, both of you.
Thank you very much for a fascinating conversation. Yeah.
And thank you, Sharon. And for those, would you like to just hold the book up for a second, Liz, so people can see what it looks like? They can recognize it. There we go. 2 versions of it. Is on Amazon. Please feel free to go and buy it and learn something that has been a really interesting story that we've had just a snippet and insight of today. But as you can see, Liz is still very much in the book and very much in being the author of the book and the trauma and catharsis that this book has brought her. So thank you very much, Liz. We could talk another hour, but I look forward to seeing you in person soon. Thank you very much to everyone who's attended, and thank you from the South African Chamber. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sharon.
Bye.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.